The lake was calm that evening, the water still as glass, reflecting the orange glow of the sinking sun. Cabins dotted the shore, their windows glowing with warm lamplight, smoke curling lazily from chimneys as families settled into their dinners. Children's laughter drifted faintly across the valley, and even the dogs lay stretched on porches, dozing in the comfort of peace. It was the kind of evening where nothing should disturb the silence, but the peace shattered the moment sharp heels struck against the gravel path. Karen, the HOA president, marched forward like a storm in human form, her face set in a mask of pride, a folder of papers clutched tight in her hand. Everyone who saw her knew what was coming, because Karen never walked with such fury unless she had chosen her next victim. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains or leaned nervously on porch railings as she approached the cabin by the water's edge. It was a quiet cabin, built of old timber, standing firm on the land long before Karen's HOA existed. The man who lived there was known for his silence, for his calm eyes and steady walk. He was polite but private, and though people liked him, no one truly knew his story. That mystery alone seemed to bother Karen more than anything else. She thrived on control, and control slipped easily through her fingers whenever she looked at him. Tonight, she meant to end it. She stomped onto his porch without waiting for an invitation and banged on the door with the flat of her hand. "Open up," she shouted, her voice shrill enough to carry across the lake. "This cabin is not in compliance. You must register under the HOA immediately." The door opened slowly, and the man stepped out with calm steps, his face unreadable, his eyes as steady as the lake behind him. He didn't flinch at her shouting, didn't reach for the papers she waved in his face. He simply looked at her as if measuring her words against some truth she did not yet know. Karen lifted the papers higher, shaking them like a weapon. "Violation of Section 12, she barked. "Failure to apply for membership. Unauthorized cabin maintenance. You think you can live here outside my rules? Impossible. Every property around this lake falls under HOA control, and I am the president. That means you answer to me." She smirked, glancing at the neighbors who were gathering now, whispering nervously. "If you don't sign these forms today, I'll fine you every week until you do. And when the fines are not enough, I'll have you evicted. Do you understand me?" The man didn't blink. He let her words hang in the air until even the neighbors began to shift uneasily, waiting for him to respond. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm, almost quiet, but clear enough that everyone nearby heard it. "Do your rules work on land you don't own?" The question struck her like a slap. Her smirk faltered, and a ripple of murmurs passed through the neighbors. Karen recovered quickly, laughing sharply. "Don't play games with me," she snapped. "This land falls under HOA jurisdiction. I know every inch of this valley. I have maps, I have records, and I have authority. You're nothing more than a stubborn squatter." She shoved the papers toward him again, expecting him to finally fold, to bow like so many had before. But he did not take them. They slid against his chest and fell to the porch boards with a soft rustle. The neighbors gasped. No one had ever dared ignore her like that. Children clung to their parents, their wide eyes fixed on the scene. A dog barked once, as if sensing the tension that thickened the air. Karen's face turned crimson with rage. "How dare you?" she hissed, stepping closer, her finger jabbing toward him. "Do you think you're above the law? That cabin, that porch, that land under your feet, it belongs to us. To the HOA. And if you resist, you'll regret it." The man tilted his head slightly, studying her as if she were nothing more than a loud bird squawking in the trees. "You believe you own this place," he said softly, his calm eyes never leaving hers. "But belief is not truth." Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. His words stirred something in them, something long buried under years of fear. Karen's face twisted, her pride fighting against the chill that crept up her spine. "Belief?" she repeated with a mocking laugh. "I don't need belief. I have power. I have the board. And if you think you can challenge me, you'll learn quickly that this valley bends to my will." She turned sharply, raising her voice so the neighbors could hear. "You all know what happens to those who defy me. Ask the Thompsons who lost their dock. Ask the millers who paid triple fines for their garden. Ask the kids who had their swing set torn down. This man thinks he can resist, but we all know how this ends. She expected nods of agreement, expected heads to bow in silence. But tonight, something was different. The neighbors didn't lower their eyes. They looked at her, then at the man standing calm and unshaken, and whispered louder than before. The man finally stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He stood a breath away from Karen, his height casting a shadow across her perfect posture. His voice dropped lower, but still everyone heard. You've built your throne on fear. But fear is brittle. One truth will break it. Karen sneered, though her smile faltered. What truth? What could you possibly have that I haven't already taken? He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the edge of the porch, crouched beside an old iron box hidden beneath a stone, and lifted it with steady hands. The neighbors leaned forward, curiosity burning in their eyes. He untied a faded strap and held up a leather folder, its edges worn, its seal pressed deep into the cover. He did not open it. Not yet. He only let the weight of it hang in the air. This, he said simply, is older than your rules. Older than your board. Older than your voice. A hush fell over the crowd. Karen's eyes narrowed, but something in them flickered, something like fear. She tried to laugh it off, but the sound cracked. Old papers mean nothing, she said quickly, too quickly. The only law here is mine. The man looked at her, calm as ever, and spoke words that settled deep into every ear. The land will tell its own story, and it is not yours to claim. The evening air grew heavier. The sun dipped lower, painting the lake blood red, as if the valley itself was waiting for the storm that had just begun. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her mouth half open as if the words the man had spoken were too heavy to process. The neighbors leaned forward, whispering louder now, their curiosity battling against the fear they had carried for so long. The man still held the leather folder in his hand, its old surface glowing faintly in the fading sunlight. He didn't raise his voice, didn't push the moment. He only stood still, and his silence carried more weight than all of Karen's shouting. The quiet made her tremble. She couldn't let it last. She stepped forward sharply, her heels stabbing the porch. That's just a trick, she barked, trying to sound confident, though her voice quivered at the edges. Old papers don't matter here. The board is the only law. I am the only authority. She looked around at the neighbors, searching for nods of agreement, but the faces staring back were different tonight. They weren't cowed like before. They were watching her closely, watching him even more, their eyes wide, waiting for answers. The control she had relied on for years was slipping, and she knew it. The man finally lowered the folder, placing it gently on the wooden table by his porch as if he was setting down a piece of history itself. Then he straightened, his calm eyes sweeping across the crowd. For years, he said softly, you've been told your homes are not yours. You've been made to believe that every flower you plant, every toy your children play with, every shutter you paint must be approved by her hand. And you've lived in fear that she would take from you what you built with your own sweat. His gaze returned to Karen. But the ground beneath your feet does not answer to fear. Karen's face turned scarlet. She snapped her fingers at the man in the red jacket who was always trailing her like a loyal shadow. Record this, she hissed. We'll use his lies against him. The man in the red jacket raised his phone hesitantly, but his eyes flicked nervously toward the leather folder on the table. Even he looked uneasy now. The man did not flinch. He walked slowly down the steps of the porch, standing at the edge of the road where everyone could see him. The lake shimmered behind him, the sun sinking lower until it cast his figure in a golden outline. His calm voice rose just enough to carry across the street. This folder holds deeds signed long before this board existed. It holds maps, signatures, and seals that show who owns this land, not just this cabin, but the valley itself. A gasp rippled through the neighbors. They turned to one another, stunned, their voices rising into urgent whispers. Karen laughed harshly, though it sounded more like desperation than victory. Do you really believe him? She shouted at the crowd. His bluffing. He's a liar, a manipulator trying to destroy the order we built. Without me, you'd have chaos. You'd have nothing." She turned back to the man, sneering. "If you think a pile of dusty papers will save you, you're more foolish than I thought." The man studied her quietly, then spoke again. "You say without you, there would be chaos. But look around." He gestured at the neighbors, at their tight grips on one another's arms, at the nervous hope flickering in their eyes. "What have you built? Not order. Fear. You made mothers cry over gardens, fathers tremble over toys, and elders bow their heads over shutters. That is not order. That is theft." His words rang through the street like a bell tolling the hour of reckoning. The neighbors murmured louder, some nodding, some whispering their own stories aloud for the first time. "She fined me for roses," one woman muttered bitterly. "She tore down my son's swing," another said through clenched teeth. An old man's voice cracked as he added, "She made me pay for a fence 3 times over." Their voices layered into something heavier than Karen's threats, a tide of truth. Karen raised her arms, shouting above them, her voice shrill. "Quiet! All of you! Don't be fooled by him. He's nothing. He's just a squatter with a story." But her words didn't hush them. Instead, her voice was drowned by their murmurs, by their pain finally surfacing, by the truth they had been forced to swallow for years. The man didn't need to raise his voice anymore. He simply looked at her, his eyes calm but sharp. "You believe you rule this lake," he said. "But tomorrow, when the law reads these papers, you will learn the truth. You are not the owner. You never were. And everything you built on fear will crumble." The neighbors fell silent at those words. A chill ran down Karen's spine despite the warm evening air. For the first time, she felt her grip loosening not because of defiance, but because of truth. She gathered the scattered papers she had brought, crumpling them in her fists, and hissed through clenched teeth, "This isn't over." Then she turned sharply, her heels striking the gravel, her red-jacketed assistant scrambling behind her. The neighbors stayed where they were, watching her retreat, their faces a mixture of awe and cautious hope. Slowly, one by one, they turned back to the man still standing at the edge of the road, steady as stone, the lake shimmering behind him. He gave them a single nod, calm and certain, then picked up the leather folder and carried it back inside his cabin. The lantern flickered in his window as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the valley seemed to exhale, as though it too had been holding its breath. That night, whispers spread like wildfire. Neighbors gathered around tables, talking in hushed but excited voices. They remembered their fines, their losses, their fears, but they also remembered the calm in his eyes, the weight in his words, and the folder that seemed older than the board itself. For the first time, they wondered if Karen's rule was not unbreakable after all. And for the first time, they dared to hope. The morning after the confrontation, the valley was buzzing like a hive. Word had spread faster than wildfire. Karen, the mighty HOA president, had been challenged on her own battlefield, and for the first time she had not walked away as the victor. Neighbors gathered in pairs on porches, in trios at the cafe near the lake road, and in larger groups down by the docks. Their whispers were different now, no longer weighed with fear, but heavy with curiosity, even excitement. "Did you see how calm he was?" One woman said. "He didn't even raise his voice, but it felt stronger than all her shouting." Another leaned in, lowering his tone. "That folder he showed, it looked old. Real old. What if he actually owns the valley?" The conversations rippled from house to house, and though fear still lingered, something else had begun to take its place: hope. Meanwhile, at the grand clubhouse on the hill, Karen stormed through the glass doors, her heels snapping against the polished floor like gunshots. The board members sat waiting at the long table, their faces stiff, eyes wary. She slammed the crumpled papers from the night before onto the table and hissed, "Do you know what he did to me? He humiliated me in front of everyone. He dared to stand against me with old tricks, and the people listened." Her voice rose, sharp and cutting. "If he convinces them, the entire HOA crumbles. We will lose control. And if we lose control, we lose everything." One of the board members, A man with thin glasses and a nervous twitch cleared his throat carefully. But what if his documents are real? Karen turned on him like a hawk, her eyes burning. Don't you dare question me. Those papers are nothing but forgeries, a show to confuse weak minds. He wants to destroy the order we built. She leaned closer, her tone lowering to a growl. And I will not allow it. If he will not bow to rules, then I will break him. Her plan unfolded quickly. By noon, inspectors in official jackets arrived at the cabin, their clipboards ready, their expressions cold. Neighbors watched from porches as Karen walked proudly behind them, arms crossed, smirk firmly back on her face. Search everything, she ordered. Check the well, check the chimney, check every nail in his walls. This place is unsafe, unapproved, and illegal. The inspectors obeyed, wandering the cabin, measuring, writing, shaking their heads as if trying to please the woman who had summoned them. Karen watched the neighbors gather and raised her voice so all could hear. This is what happens when you refuse to join the HOA. Safety standards matter. He will be out before the week is done. The man stood on his porch as still as stone, watching the performance unfold. He neither protested nor argued, his calm eyes following each inspector with patience. When one approached him, clipboard in hand, the man simply held out the leather folder. The inspector hesitated, glanced at Karen, then reluctantly opened it. Inside were the deeds again, clear seals pressed deep, maps hand-drawn with precise boundaries stretching wider than the lake itself. The inspector's eyes flickered, his jaw tightening as the truth sank in. Karen noticed his hesitation and snapped, "Ignore that junk. Do your job." But the neighbors had already seen the inspector's change. Whispers rose louder, stronger. "He's not lying," someone murmured. "Those papers are real." By evening, Karen's anger boiled over. She gathered her board again, pacing the floor like a caged predator. "They are slipping away from me," she growled. "The neighbors are beginning to believe him. If they trust him more than me, I am finished. Do you understand? Finished." She stopped suddenly, her eyes glinting with cruelty. "Then we cannot wait. If law and inspectors won't remove him fast enough, we'll use the police. Tomorrow, I'll call them. I'll claim his trespassing, that he threatened me, that his documents are forged. Once he's dragged away in handcuffs, no one will dare believe him again." The board members shifted uneasily, but none dared to oppose her. That night, the neighbors gathered quietly near the lake, their lanterns glowing in the dark. They spoke in low voices, their fear clashing with newfound courage. An old man rubbed his hands together and said, "She's planning something. I've lived under her rules long enough to know she won't stop." A young mother added, "But we can't let her keep winning. Did you hear him? He said the land doesn't answer to fear." They all looked toward the cabin, its lantern glowing softly in the window. Inside, the man sat at his table, the folder open once again, his wife beside him, his children asleep in the next room. His wife touched his arm gently. "She will come back harder tomorrow," she said softly. He nodded, his voice steady. "Yes, fear always returns for one more fight, but truth doesn't leave." Outside, the neighbors watched the lantern flicker in his window and felt something they hadn't in years: safety. They whispered promises to one another, small but powerful. "If she brings the police, we'll stand there too. If she tries to break him, she'll have to break us first." For the first time, the valley's people began to stand taller, not because fear was gone, but because truth had begun to outshine it. By dawn, the valley was split in two, Karen, preparing her next attack with all the power of her position, and the neighbors, quietly choosing sides. The stage was set for the battle that would decide who the valley truly belonged to: the president with her paper rules, or the man with the deeds that could tear her empire apart. The next day arrived heavy with tension, the kind of morning where the air itself felt thick, as if it carried secrets. The sun barely broke through the clouds, and the usual sounds of children playing or dogs barking were absent. Instead, the valley seemed to wait, holding its breath. The neighbors stayed close to their porches, their eyes fixed on the road that curved toward the cabin by the lake. They had all heard Karen's threats the night before. They knew she was planning to bring the police, and they feared what kind of storm would follow. The man sat calmly on his porch, sipping from a tin cup of coffee. His wife moved quietly inside, her hands busy with small tasks, though her eyes often drifted to the window, watching the road with unease. Their children played softly on the rug, unaware of the weight pressing on the valley that morning. The leather folder lay on the table just inside the door, its worn edges and deep seals carrying more strength than any voice shouting outside. By late morning, the sound of engines broke the silence. 2 police cars rolled slowly down the gravel road, their tires crunching against the stones, their lights flashing faintly though their sirens were silent. Behind them came Karen, striding proudly, her red jacket bright against the gray sky. She carried more papers in her hand, her smile sharp and full of victory. The neighbors gathered quickly, some stepping into the street, others pressing close to the fences. Their whispers rose, anxious but ready. The cars stopped in front of the cabin. 2 officers stepped out, their hands resting on their belts, their faces calm but serious. Karen rushed forward before they could even speak. "Officers, thank you for coming," she said loudly, making sure the neighbors could all hear. "This man is trespassing on HOA property. He has refused membership, forged documents, and threatened the peace of this community. I demand you remove him immediately." She shoved her stack of papers toward the officers, her voice dripping with authority. The man remained seated on his porch, his eyes calm as the lake, his hands steady on the cup he held. When the officers turned to him, he simply set the cup aside, rose to his feet, and stepped down onto the gravel. He reached just inside the door and pulled out the leather folder, holding it with both hands as if it were a shield of truth. Without a word, he offered it to the nearest officer. The officer opened the folder and began to read. The crowd leaned closer, their breaths caught. Page after page revealed maps, seals, and signatures dating back generations. The officer's brow furrowed as he read carefully, his eyes narrowing with focus. His partner leaned over, scanning the documents as well. Karen's smile twitched. She shifted nervously, but quickly barked, "Don't be fooled by those tricks. They are fake. Old paper doesn't mean anything. You are here to enforce the law, not to play historian." But the officer shook his head slowly. "These are not fake," he said, his voice calm but firm. He turned to Karen, his eyes steady. "These deeds are older than your HOA. They're stamped and recorded. This land is his." The neighbors gasped, a ripple of shock running through the crowd. Karen's face drained of color, then flushed red as she tried to recover. "No, no, this is impossible," she shrieked. "I built this community. I wrote the rules. This place answers to me." She pointed a trembling finger at the man. "Arrest him. Arrest him now." The officer stepped back, his voice colder now. There will be no arrest. Not today." He glanced at the neighbors, their faces lit with the first sparks of courage. "If you want to challenge ownership, you take it to court. But until then, you have no right to remove him." Karen's scream tore through the air, shrill and desperate. "Court? You think I'll lose to him in court? I will bury him in lawsuits. I will drown him in legal fees. He will crawl away from this valley with nothing." She turned to the neighbors, shouting, "And all of you, you'll regret this. Without me, this place will fall apart." But no one answered. They only stared at her, their silence louder than her threats. The man finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "Fear has kept this valley quiet for too long. But fear ends when truth speaks." He took the folder back from the officer, tucking it under his arm. "Tomorrow, in court, the truth will speak again." The neighbors stirred, their whispers growing into louder voices. "We'll stand with him," one called out. "No more fear," another added. Soon the crowd was chanting softly, "No more fear. No more fear." Karen's eyes darted wildly, her control slipping from her grasp. She stumbled backward, her papers shaking in her hands, her red jacket no longer a symbol of power but of desperation. The police cars pulled away, leaving dust swirling in the air. Karen stormed back toward the clubhouse, her heels striking the ground like hammers, but each step sounded weaker than the last. The neighbors didn't scatter this time. They lingered, speaking openly, their courage no longer hidden in whispers. They turned to the man, some nodding, some clapping his shoulder as they passed. For the first time, they weren't just looking at him as a neighbor. They were looking at him as the one who carried the truth they all needed. That night, the valley glowed with lanterns again, brighter and steadier than before. Families gathered outside, talking freely, telling stories of fines and threats they had hidden for years. The fear was still there, but it was breaking, cracking like ice under the warmth of fire. And in the quiet of his cabin, the man sat with his wife, the leather folder resting on the table between them. She touched his hand softly. "Tomorrow will be harder," she whispered. He nodded, his calm eyes fixed on the flames in the hearth. "Yes," he said, "but tomorrow, fear will fall." The courthouse smelled of polished wood and dust when the people of the valley filled it the next morning. They came early, some before sunrise, to claim seats on the hard benches. Families who once hid behind curtains now walked boldly through the doors, children clinging to their parents' hands, elders standing straighter than they had in years. Reporters lined the walls, cameras ready, pens scratching on notepads, sensing a story far greater than a local dispute. Everyone was waiting for the moment when truth and fear would collide. Karen entered with the same fury that had carried her through the valley for years. She wore her sharpest suit, her hair pinned into a perfect knot, her lips stretched into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her lawyer carried a thick stack of files, dropping them on the table with a loud thud meant to intimidate. She swept her gaze over the benches, sneering when she saw the neighbors gathered in such numbers. But when her eyes landed on the man, seated calmly at the front with his wife and children beside him, the leather folder on the table before him, her smile flickered. He didn't look afraid, not even uncertain. His calmness unsettled her more than anger ever could. The judge entered, robe flowing, gavel in hand. The courtroom hushed as the sound of wood striking wood echoed through the chamber. His voice was stern but steady. "We are here to determine rightful ownership of this land and the actions of the HOA board. Both sides will be heard." His eyes swept over Karen, then over the man, then to the crowded benches filled with neighbors leaning forward, their faces hungry for justice. Karen's lawyer rose first, his voice smooth and trained. He launched into a speech about order, about safety, about rules that kept the valley clean and prosperous. He waved photographs of cabins, copies of HOA bylaws, and reports filled with jargon. "This man," the lawyer declared, pointing sharply at the man, "seeks to undermine decades of order. He waves old documents around, but the truth is simple. He is nothing more than a squatter clinging to history that no longer applies. Without the HOA, this valley falls into chaos." Karen nodded along, her eyes glittering as if she already saw victory. The judge listened patiently, then turned to the other side. The Attorney General stood, tall and commanding, and placed the leather folder on the judge's bench. His voice was deeper, calmer, but carried far greater weight. "What the board calls outdated tricks are in fact the foundation of law," he said firmly. "These deeds are original, signed, sealed, and recorded long before the HOA was ever imagined. They do not represent manipulation. They represent truth." He opened the folder carefully, laying out pages one by one. The room leaned forward, reporters snapping photos as the judge examined seals pressed deep into thick paper, maps marked with rivers and hills, signatures inked by hands long gone but still legally binding. The judge's brow furrowed as he studied the documents, then softened as he nodded slowly. The Attorney General's voice rang clear. "This land belongs not to a board built on fear, but to the family of this man. And today, the truth stands against tyranny." The neighbors erupted in murmurs, some gasping, others whispering prayers of thanks. Karen shot to her feet, her voice shrill. "Lies! Old scraps of paper don't matter. I am the president. The board decides. They signed agreements when they moved here." She spun toward the benches, her voice rising. Tell them you need me." But no voices answered. The silence of the neighbors was heavier than any shout. The judge cleared his throat. "We will hear testimony," he said, striking the gavel once. "Let the community speak." An elderly man rose first, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the bench. "She fined me for my shutters," he said, his voice trembling but loud enough to carry. "3 times I repainted them, and 3 times she said the color was wrong. I spent my savings trying to please her. It was never enough." A mother stood next, tears in her eyes. "She ripped out my garden. Said my flowers were unapproved. They were roses from my grandmother's house." Her voice broke. A young father followed, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. "She threatened to take me to court over a swing set. My boy cried for weeks when they tore it down." One by one, the neighbors spoke. Each story added to the mountain of truth, each word chipping away at the wall of fear Karen had built around them. The courtroom filled with their voices, shaky at first, then stronger, until they echoed like a chorus of defiance. Karen tried to interrupt, slamming her hands on the table. "They are lying. They're all ungrateful. Without me, none of this would exist." But the judge silenced her with a sharp strike of the gavel. "Sit down. Your time to speak will come." Finally, the man himself stood. He walked slowly to the stand, his calm step steady, his eyes never leaving the judge. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried through the room like the steady beat of a drum. "I built my cabin with my own hands," he said. "I raised my family here, on land passed down through generations. I asked for nothing from the board, and in return they gave me fines, threats, and fear. But fear is not law. Fear is not truth. This land has always been mine, and no voice, no board, no threat will take it." The courtroom erupted again, neighbors clapping, cheering, some with tears streaming down their faces. The judge struck the gavel hard, restoring order, but even he could not hide the faint respect in his eyes as he looked at the man. Karen stood one last time, her voice desperate, almost wild. "He's tricked you all. Without me, you'll destroy yourselves. You need me." But her words no longer carried the weight they once did. The neighbors only looked at her with cold eyes, their fear gone, their courage burning. The judge's gavel struck again. "This court will reconvene tomorrow morning for final judgment," he declared. The sound echoed like thunder, sealing the day's truth. As people poured out of the courthouse, they did not walk in silence. They walked together, talking openly, their voices rising like music. For the first time in years, the valley felt alive. And as the man stepped into the sunlight with his family, the leather folder in his hand, the neighbors gathered around him, clapping his shoulders, whispering, "We're with you." Karen slipped out a side door, her smile broken, her papers clutched like ashes in her hands. For the first time, she walked not as a ruler but as a woman losing her crown. And the valley, once bound by her grip, felt the chains begin to break. The courthouse was quieter the next morning, but it was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. The neighbors filled the benches again, their faces pale but determined, whispering to one another about what would happen today. The man sat calmly at his table, his wife beside him, the leather folder resting like a silent weapon in front of them. His children sat in the back with neighbors who had promised to watch them, their innocent eyes scanning the crowded room. Across the aisle, Karen entered with her lawyer, her posture stiff, her smile stretched too tightly across her face. She carried a new stack of papers, thicker than before, her hands clutching them as though they were her salvation. The judge struck the gavel once, and silence swept the room. "We continue," he said firmly. Karen's lawyer stood quickly, adjusting his tie, his voice louder than necessary. "Your Honor, new evidence has come to light overnight," he declared, lifting the stack of documents. "These reports, filed by certified inspectors, prove beyond doubt that the cabin is unsafe. The foundation is unstable, the chimney is hazardous, and the water supply is contaminated. Not only does this man have no rightful ownership, but his very presence here endangers the community." He handed the papers to the judge with a flourish, as though presenting a final blow. Gasps echoed through the benches. Neighbors leaned closer to one another, their whispers rising like rustling leaves in a storm. Some glanced at the man with worry, others at Karen with suspicion. Karen smiled wider, her confidence swelling as she watched the judge flip through the papers. She even leaned back in her chair, whispering to her lawyer, "This will bury him. He won't recover." But the Attorney General rose, his tall figure casting a long shadow. His voice was calm but sharp. "Your Honor, we demand verification." These documents appeared suddenly, in the middle of the night. Who ordered these inspections? He turned his eyes toward Karen, steady and unyielding. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Yes, I would like to know that as well." Karen stiffened but forced her smile back into place. "The county responded to community concerns," she said quickly, avoiding the Attorney General's gaze. But her words rang hollow, and the neighbors knew it. Murmurs broke out again, louder this time. One woman stood suddenly, her voice trembling but brave. "We never filed those concerns. No inspector came to our homes." "She's lying." Another neighbor added, "No one saw inspectors here last night. She made those up." The judge's brow darkened as he looked closer at the reports. The signatures were shaky, the seals uneven, the dates suspiciously fresh. His gavel struck hard. "If these documents are false, this court will treat it as an attempt to deceive the law. Do you understand?" His eyes burned into Karen's. For the first time, her confidence faltered openly. Her hands shook as she tried to gather her words. This is a misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice breaking. "I was only trying to," but the judge silenced her with another sharp strike of the gavel. The man finally stood, his calm presence drawing every eye. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Do you see?" he asked, turning toward the neighbors. "Every time the truth rises, she hides it beneath new lies. She fined you for your gardens, your children's toys, your shutters and doors. And when those lies were not enough, she forged new ones. But truth does not break. Truth does not vanish. And truth is what will decide this valley." The neighbors erupted into cheers and shouts. Some clapped, others wept, their fear finally cracking into anger. "No more lies," someone cried. "No more fear." The chant grew until the walls of the courthouse seemed to tremble with it. Karen shouted above them, her face red, her voice shrill. "Silence! You fools! Without me you will collapse. Without me, this valley will eat itself alive." But her words were drowned beneath the roar of the people she once ruled. Even her own lawyer shifted uneasily in his seat, refusing to meet her eyes. The judge struck the gavel hard, demanding order, but the verdict of the crowd was already written on their faces. They no longer feared her. They no longer bowed to her voice. Karen sank slowly into her chair, her shoulders trembling, her smile shattered into a grimace. The judge leaned forward, his tone icy. "This court will review the authenticity of these new documents. But make no mistake, any further attempt to deceive will carry consequences." The session ended with the gavel's sharp echo, but the people did not leave quietly. They left together, their voices rising in chants of unity, their lanterns already prepared to light the valley again that night. Outside, reporters rushed forward, asking questions, but the neighbors answered louder than anyone. "We won't live in fear anymore," they declared. The man walked slowly down the courthouse steps, his wife at his side, the folder once more under his arm. He paused at the bottom, looking over the sea of neighbors who had gathered close, their faces bright with courage. His calm voice carried above the noise. "Fear always comes back for one last fight. But the truth is patient. The truth always waits, and it always wins." The people cheered, their lanterns raised high, their voices echoing into the hills. Karen watched from a distance, her hands gripping the railing, her body trembling with rage. For the first time, she saw not followers, but a valley that had slipped from her grasp. The chains she had wrapped around them had snapped, and no amount of shouting would pull them back. She turned away, her heels striking hard against the courthouse steps, each step sounding weaker than the last. That night, as darkness fell, The valley was alive with light. Lanterns lined the paths, the docks, the porches, glowing like stars scattered across the earth. Children laughed without fear, neighbors sang softly by the fire, and the air felt lighter than it had in years. In the cabin by the lake, the man sat with his family, the folder resting quietly on the table. His wife touched his hand and whispered, "She won't stop." He nodded slowly, his eyes calm. "No," he said, "but neither will the truth." The courthouse was packed tighter than ever the following morning. Neighbors filled every bench, some even standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway. Reporters crowded the back, their cameras flashing, their pens scratching furiously, eager to capture the collapse of a reign that had lasted far too long. The air was heavy, but it was not the weight of fear anymore, it was the weight of anticipation. Everyone knew something final was coming. Everyone wanted to see it with their own eyes. Karen arrived later than usual. She walked in briskly, but her once proud stride had turned stiff, her red jacket no longer a symbol of power but of desperation. Her lawyer followed, his shoulders hunched, his face pale. She sat down quickly, keeping her chin high, though her hands trembled as she arranged her papers. Across the aisle, the man sat with his wife and children, the leather folder resting calmly in front of him. He did not move much, but his presence filled the room. The neighbors' eyes kept drifting toward him, their whispers carrying confidence instead of fear. The judge struck the gavel, the sound echoing like thunder through the chamber. "Order. This court resumes." His eyes were sharp, colder than before, and his patience clearly thin. "Yesterday, we saw attempts to deceive this court with false reports. Today, I will hear the truth, and only the truth." His gaze cut toward Karen, and her forced smile faltered. The Attorney General rose first, his tall figure steady, his voice commanding. "Your Honor, we have examined the so-called inspection reports presented yesterday. They are not legitimate. The signatures were falsified, the seals forged, and the dates do not match the county records. This was not evidence. It was an attempt to manipulate this court." He let the words hang in the air, then added, "And it shows how desperate the HOA president has become to cling to control she never had." The neighbors erupted in murmurs of agreement, some shaking their heads, others muttering angrily. Karen slammed her hand on the table, rising to her feet. "Lies!" she shrieked. "All lies. You're all blind to his tricks. Without me, this valley will collapse into chaos. You need me. You all need me." Her voice cracked as she shouted, her words bouncing off walls that no longer obeyed her. The judge's gavel struck hard. "Sit down," he said sharply. "You will speak when it is your turn." One by one, neighbors began to rise from the benches, their courage stronger than ever. An old woman stood, her back bent but her voice clear. "For 20 years, she fined me for the color of my curtains. Curtains. She told me what I could hang in my own windows." A young man followed, his fists clenched at his sides. "She forced me to tear down the treehouse I built for my children. Said it wasn't approved. My kids cried for days." Another stood, tears in her eyes. "She humiliated me in meetings, called me lazy because my grass grew too tall when my husband was in the hospital." Their voices filled the courtroom, one after another, a rising tide of truth. The man did not interrupt them, did not speak over them. He only sat silently, his calm eyes steady, listening to the people he had quietly defended by simply standing firm against fear. Karen tried to shout them down. "Ungrateful. All of you. I kept this place in order. Without my rules, you'd live in filth." But her words no longer held power. The neighbors kept speaking, louder now, their voices growing into something she could not silence. The walls that once echoed her threats now echoed their defiance. Finally, the man rose. The crowd fell quiet instantly, every eye turning toward him. He walked slowly to the front, his step steady, his presence commanding without effort. He turned first to the judge, then to the neighbors, then finally to Karen. His voice was calm, but it carried through every corner of the room. "You see her words. You hear her rage. This is how she has ruled for years. Through fear, through threats, through fines and lies. But today you heard something stronger. You heard truth. You heard voices that will not be silenced again. He paused, his eyes steady on the crowd. The land does not belong to fear. It never did. It belongs to the people who live upon it. And fear's time is finished. The neighbors rose to their feet, clapping, shouting, cheering through tears. Their voices merged into one roar that shook the chamber. No more fear. No more fear. The chant thundered, unstoppable, echoing down the halls and spilling into the streets outside. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing, capturing the moment that power changed hands. Karen covered her ears, her face twisted with rage and panic. "Stop! Stop this madness!" she screamed. She turned to the judge, her voice breaking. "You can't let them do this. You can't let him take everything." But even the judge looked at her with tired eyes, as if her power had already dissolved before the verdict could be spoken. The gavel struck hard, silencing the roar. The judge's voice was firm. "This court will deliver its ruling tomorrow morning. Until then, let this be clear, fear will not rule this chamber." The session ended, but the people did not leave quietly. They filed out together, their voices still strong, still chanting, their lanterns waiting to be lit that night. Outside, the courthouse steps became a gathering place, a celebration before the verdict had even been read. They had seen Karen stripped of her mask, exposed before them all, and they no longer trembled under her shadow. The man stepped outside with his wife and children. Neighbors surrounded him, clapping his back, thanking him, promising their support. He nodded to each of them, his calm eyes reflecting the lanterns beginning to glow in the fading light. Karen, meanwhile, slipped out a side door with her lawyer, her head down, her papers clutched tightly to her chest. No one followed her. No one listened. For the first time in years, she walked alone. That night, the valley shone brighter than ever. Lanterns lined every porch, every dock, every trail. Families gathered outside, their laughter carrying across the water, their courage no longer hidden. The valley that had once lived under Karen's iron grip now belonged to its people again. And tomorrow, when the final judgment came, they knew the last chain would break. The night before the final ruling, the valley did not sleep. Lanterns glowed in every window, their light flickering across the water like stars scattered on the lake. Families gathered outside their homes, speaking in hushed but excited voices. Some brought out chairs to sit beneath the dark sky, others walked to neighbors they had barely spoken to before, sharing stories of fines and threats they had carried silently for years. Now those burdens were out in the open, and though fear still lingered, hope burned brighter. Children ran freely, their laughter ringing where silence used to dominate. For the first time in many years, the valley felt alive. Inside the cabin, the man sat at his wooden table, the leather folder resting between him and his wife. The papers inside had been examined again and again, their seals and maps now known to every curious eye in the valley. His wife leaned forward, her fingers brushing the worn edges. "Tomorrow decides everything," she whispered. Her eyes searched his face for a trace of worry, but he only looked calm, his gaze steady as ever. "It doesn't decide everything," he said softly. "It confirms what is already true. The land remembers, even when people forget." Their children slept in the next room, their small breath steady, safe at last in a home that no one could take from them. On the other side of the valley, the clubhouse stood silent, its windows dark except for one. Karen paced inside her office, her red jacket thrown over a chair, her hands clutching papers she no longer trusted. Her lawyer sat slumped at the far end of the table, exhausted, warning her to prepare for defeat. But Karen's pride burned hotter than her fear. She stared at her reflection in the glass, muttering to herself, "They need me. They always needed me. Without me, they'll collapse." Her words rang hollow, even to her own ears, but she clung to them as if they were the last stones in a crumbling wall. By dawn, the courthouse steps were crowded long before the doors opened. Neighbors arrived in groups, carrying lanterns they had refused to extinguish, holding them high even in daylight. Reporters jostled for space, microphones raised, their voices buzzing like insects, asking for comments about the battle for the valley. The air was thick with tension, yet beneath it ran an undercurrent of celebration. People smiled nervously, whispered prayers, and held their children close. The man arrived quietly, walking with his wife at his side, the leather folder tucked under his arm. The crowd parted for him as though by instinct, their voices softening as he passed. Some reached out to touch his arm, to nod at him, to whisper, "We're with you." His calm presence steadied them, his silence more powerful than any speech. Karen arrived minutes later, stepping out of her car with her chin high, her suit perfectly pressed. But the cheers that greeted the man did not come for her. Instead, the crowd turned cold. Some muttered, others crossed their arms, refusing to look at her. She marched quickly up the steps, her lawyer hurrying behind, her papers clutched like a shield. For the first time, she felt the weight of walking into a room where no one wanted her. Inside, the courtroom was already humming with energy. The benches overflowed, the air thick with expectation. The judge entered, and silence fell instantly. His eyes scanned the room, then landed on Karen, who sat stiffly, her knuckles white against the papers in her hands. He turned to the man, who sat calm and steady, the folder resting before him once more. The judge struck the gavel. "This court will deliver its judgment today," he said. "But before I rule, both sides will be given one final chance to speak." Karen's lawyer rose, his voice strained, his arguments thinner than ever. He repeated the same lines about order, about safety, about the chaos that would follow without the HOA. His words echoed dully, falling flat against the faces of neighbors who no longer believed them. Karen whispered urgently to him, her smile twitching, but the crowd did not stir. Her voice had lost its grip. Then the Attorney General rose. His voice was clear, steady, commanding. He lifted the folder, holding it high enough for all to see. "This," he said, "is not just paper. It is history. It is law. It is truth. And truth does not vanish because someone louder demands it. This land belongs to him, and through him, to every family that has suffered under lies and fear. Today, you do not just judge a case. You restore freedom to a valley." The neighbors erupted into applause, their voices filling the room, their courage louder than the gavel that tried to quiet them. The man stood last. He did not raise his hands or shout for attention. He simply looked at the neighbors, then at the judge, then at Karen. His calm voice carried easily in the silence that followed. "I did not come to fight her. I came to stand for what is mine, and for what is yours. Fear made you bow your heads. Truth lifted them again. Tomorrow, this valley will belong to the people once more." The crowd stood, clapping, cheering, some with tears in their eyes. Karen rose too, but her voice cracked, desperate. "You fools," she screamed. "Without me, you'll destroy yourselves. You need me. You always needed me." But no one listened. They only turned their backs, their cheers drowning out her last attempt at power. The judge struck the gavel hard. "This court will give its ruling tomorrow morning," he declared, his voice echoing like thunder. "And it will be final." The people poured out of the courthouse chanting, their lanterns raised high even in daylight. "No more fear! No more fear!" they cried, their voices shaking the very ground. The man walked among them, his wife at his side, his calm eyes reflecting the flames of lanterns that burned like stars. Karen slipped out through a side door, her papers clutched in trembling hands, her face pale. She had once walked as a queen in this valley. Now she walked as a shadow. That night, the lanterns glowed brighter than ever, lining every path, every porch, every dock. Families gathered together, their laughter rising across the water, their voices singing softly under the stars. The valley, once silent under fear, roared with life. And as the man sat with his family by the fire, the folder resting quietly on the table, he whispered, "Tomorrow, the truth will finish what fear began." The courthouse was overflowing the next morning, every bench filled, every aisle crowded. Neighbors pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breath held tight. The air buzzed with anticipation, as though the very walls understood history was about to be written inside them. Reporters lined the back, their cameras flashing, their microphones raised high, ready to capture the end of a long reign of fear. Outside, the courthouse steps were packed with those who couldn't fit inside, lanterns raised even in daylight, glowing like small flames of defiance. Karen entered first. Her face was pale, her eyes ringed with sleepless shadows, but she forced a smile that was more a grimace than confidence. She carried another bundle of papers, though her hands shook as she clutched them. Her lawyer trailed behind, his head bowed, his steps reluctant. When she looked at the neighbors in the benches, she found not lowered eyes or bowed heads, but cold, unyielding stares. She quickly looked away, her forced pride cracking. Moments later, the man entered. He walked slowly, calmly, his wife at his side, the leather folder tucked under his arm. His children walked in with the neighbors who had taken them under their care, their small faces bright with trust. The crowd parted for him, some reaching out to touch his shoulder, others whispering blessings. He gave no speech, made no gesture. His silence carried enough weight to steady everyone in the room. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent instantly. His robe flowed behind him, his gavel heavy in his hand. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on the packed benches, the neighbors standing along the walls, the lanterns glowing faintly in windows outside. Then his eyes settled on Karen, and her forced smile faltered. He raised the gavel and struck it once, the sound echoing like thunder. "This court has heard enough," he said firmly. "Today, judgment will be delivered." The tension thickened. Every breath felt loud, every heartbeat heavy. The judge began slowly, his voice solemn. "This community has long lived under rules. Rules can guide. Rules can protect. But rules can also be twisted into weapons. Over these past days, we have heard testimony of families fined unfairly, children punished for playing, elders humiliated for simple choices. We have seen attempts to deceive this court with false reports. And we have read deeds that do not lie." He lifted the leather folder, placing it on the bench. "These documents are valid, binding, and older than the HOA itself. They prove beyond doubt that this land belongs not to the board, but to the family of this man." The room erupted in gasps. Neighbors clutched one another, some crying out in joy, others weeping with relief. The judge struck the gavel sharply for silence and continued. "Therefore, this court finds that the HOA president has abused her authority. She has used fear instead of law, threats instead of guidance. She is hereby removed from her position, and the HOA is dissolved, effective immediately. This valley is free." The gavel struck once more, final and unshakable. The room exploded into cheers. Neighbors leapt to their feet, clapping, shouting, hugging one another. Tears streamed down faces, laughter broke through sobs, and the chant began again, louder than ever, "No more fear, no more fear." The sound shook the chamber, carried down the courthouse steps, and rippled across the valley like thunder. Karen shot to her feet, her chair clattering to the floor. Her face twisted with rage and disbelief. "You can't do this," she screamed, her voice cracking. "I built this valley. I made it safe. You need me." She stumbled forward, trying to reach the judge's bench, but two officers stepped in front of her, blocking her path. She pointed wildly at the man, her hands trembling. "He tricked you. He tricked all of you. Without me, you'll destroy yourselves." But no one listened. Her words were drowned beneath the roar of the crowd. The man rose slowly, his calm presence cutting through the noise like a blade through mist. The neighbors fell silent, turning toward him as he faced them. His voice was quiet, but it carried through every corner of the room. "For years you lived with your heads bowed. For years she made you believe you were powerless. But today you stood. Today you spoke. And today, you are free." He paused, his calm eyes meeting theirs. "The valley was never hers. It was always yours." The room erupted again, louder than before. Some neighbors clapped until their hands turned red. Others lifted their children into the air. Others fell to their knees in gratitude. The judge struck his gavel, but even he allowed himself a small nod, his stern face softened by the weight of truth finally delivered. Outside, the courthouse steps turned into celebration. Lanterns glowed, even under the midday sun, their light a symbol of unity. Reporters shouted questions, their microphones thrust forward, but the neighbors answered first. "We are free," they said. "No more fear." Karen was escorted down the side steps by officers, her papers clutched like ashes in her hands. The crowd turned their backs as she passed, refusing to look at her, refusing to give her the power of their attention. For the first time in years, she walked not as a ruler, but as a woman stripped bare, defeated, forgotten. The man stepped into the sunlight with his wife and children, surrounded by neighbors who clapped his back, shook his hand, and wept with joy. Reporters shouted again, asking what he would do now that he owned the valley. He looked out over the sea of lanterns, his voice calm and steady. "I will not rule it," he said. "I will guard it. It belongs to its people, and it always will." The crowd roared with approval, their chants carrying high into the hills. That night, the valley burned brighter than the stars, every porch, every dock, every path glowing with lanterns. Families gathered with food, music, and laughter, their joy spilling into the night. The lake reflected the lights like a mirror, as if the land itself was celebrating. And in the cabin, the man sat quietly with his family, the folder closed at last. His wife leaned against him, whispering, "It's over." He nodded, his calm eyes on the glowing valley. "It's just beginning," he said softly. That night, after the gavel had fallen and the courthouse emptied, the valley was alive in a way it had never been before. Lanterns glowed on every porch, their flames flickering like stars brought down to earth. The lake shimmered, reflecting the lights as though it too wanted to join in the celebration. Families who had once kept to themselves stepped outside, carrying food, blankets, and instruments. They gathered in circles, laughing, singing, and telling stories of what they had endured and what they had overcome. Children ran barefoot through the grass, their shouts of joy echoing across the hills. For the first time in years, their voices were free from fear. At the cabin, the man sat quietly on his porch, his wife beside him, their children curled up nearby, exhausted from the excitement of the day but smiling even in sleep. The leather folder lay on the table, closed now, its purpose fulfilled. His wife touched the cover gently and whispered, "It's over at last." He looked out across the valley where lanterns glowed like fireflies and shook his head softly. "No," he said. "This is not the end. This is the beginning." His calm eyes reflected the flames of the lanterns, steady and sure. Neighbors began to gather near the cabin, bringing baskets of food, fresh bread, roasted meats, fruits, and jugs of cider. They set everything on long tables built quickly from wooden planks, and soon the area outside the cabin turned into a feast. Someone played a fiddle, another brought a drum, and music filled the night. People danced barefoot, their laughter carrying across the lake. For the first time in many years, the valley was not bound by silence or fear, it was filled with life. An old man stood near the fire, his voice trembling with emotion. "For too long we lived in the shadow of fines and threats. We thought we had no choice but to obey. But tonight, we stand free. Not because we fought with anger, but because we stood with truth." His words were met with cheers, and the crowd raised their lanterns high. The chant that had begun in the courthouse returned, stronger, more joyful than ever, "No more fear, no more fear." The hills echoed with the sound, carrying the message far beyond the valley. Karen's name was barely mentioned. When it was spoken softly, almost as if she were already a ghost. Some said she had left the valley that evening, escorted away with her papers clutched like broken weapons. Others didn't care where she went. She no longer mattered. The power she once wielded had dissolved, and the valley no longer belonged to her shadow. As the night deepened, the man rose from his seat. The crowd quieted as he stepped forward, his calm presence commanding their attention without force. He looked at the faces glowing in the firelight, faces of mothers and fathers, of children, of elders who had carried burdens too long. "This land was never hers," he said softly. "It was always yours. Tonight, You proved it. And tomorrow, you will wake not as subjects of fear, but as guardians of your own homes. His voice grew steadier. The valley is not mine alone. It belongs to us all. Together, we will keep it free. The neighbors erupted into applause, their voices loud, their eyes shining with tears and pride. They embraced one another, not as victims but as a community reborn. Later, when the music faded and families began to drift back to their homes, the man remained on his porch, watching the lanterns flicker across the water. His wife leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, her voice soft. Do you think they will always remember this night? He nodded slowly, his calm eyes fixed on the glowing horizon. Yes, he said, because tonight, the valley learned that truth is stronger than fear. And truth does not fade. The dawn came quietly, painting the hills in gold. The lanterns burned low, but their memory lingered in every heart. Children woke early, eager to play, their laughter filling the morning air. Parents stepped outside without dread, their smiles unburdened. The valley had changed overnight, but the change felt permanent. The man watched the sunrise from his porch, his family gathered close. The leather folder still lay on the table, but it was no longer needed as a weapon. It was simply a reminder of what had been fought for and won. He breathed deeply, the crisp morning air filling his lungs, and whispered, "The valley is free." And in that moment, with the lake shimmering in the light of dawn and the people of the valley awake and unafraid, it was true. The valley belonged to its people again, and fear would never rule it.